I watched 2,000 people I'd worked with for 15 years march past my corner office window, holding signs with my face crossed out in red marker. "Dictator Alina," one banner screamed. Another read, "Unqualified fraud." The chanting grew louder as more employees joined from every floor of our building. "No more tyrants. No more tyrants." My hands pressed against the glass as I stared down at faces I recognized. Juniper from accounting, who I'd helped get promoted last year. Trevor from marketing, whose wedding I'd attended just months ago. Daniela from HR, who'd cried in my office when her father passed away. All of them now screaming for my removal. The security guard knocked on my door. "Ma'am, they're demanding you come down and address them. The crowd is getting bigger." I'm Elena Rodriguez, 38 years old, and I'd just been promoted to Chief Strategy Officer at one of the largest consulting firms in the country. This should have been the proudest moment of my career. Instead, I was watching my colleagues treat me like a disease they needed to cure. Before I go any further, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? Because I want to know where my story is reaching people who understand what it feels like to have everything you've earned questioned. And please hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for everyone involved. The protests started the morning after the company announced my promotion. I arrived at 7 a.m. like always, but instead of the usual empty parking lot, I found groups of employees clustered together, whispering and staring. By lunch, someone had created a petition demanding the board reverse their decision. By the end of the week, they had gathered over 2,000 signatures. The thing is, I wasn't some outsider who'd been parachuted into this role. I'd been with this company since I was 23, working my way up from junior analyst to senior director. I'd led the team that landed our biggest client ever, a government contract worth $400 million. I'd created the efficiency program that saved the company $60 million in operational costs. I'd personally trained half the people now calling for my head. But none of that mattered, because the person everyone expected to get this promotion was Garrett Whitman. Garrett was the former chief strategy officer's handpicked successor. Charming, well-connected, and completely average at his job. He'd been coasting on other people's work for years, taking credit for projects he'd barely contributed to. But he had something I didn't. He was part of the old boys network that still ran the upper levels of this company. When the board chose me instead, it wasn't just a promotion they were rejecting. It was the idea that someone like me, a woman who didn't play golf at the country club, who didn't attend the right social events, who actually did her own work, instead of delegating everything, could rise to their level. The breaking point came during the third week of protests. I was in my office reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant, Cameron, knocked on my door. His face was pale, and he was holding a printed email. "This just went out to the entire company," he said, handing me the paper. The subject line read, "Concerns about current leadership direction." It was signed by Garrett Whitman and 47 other senior employees. The email was 3 pages long, filled with corporate language that essentially said I was unfit for the role and my leadership style was damaging company culture and employee morale. But the final paragraph was what made my blood freeze. They weren't just questioning my abilities anymore. They were questioning my ethics, suggesting I had somehow manipulated or pressured the board into choosing me. They were calling me corrupt. That afternoon, I had a meeting with the board of directors. I walked into that conference room expecting them to stand behind their decision, to defend the promotion they'd unanimously approved just weeks earlier. Instead, I found 12 men and 2 women who couldn't look me in the eye. The chairman, Preston Blackwood, spoke first. "Elena, we need to discuss the current situation. The employee response to your promotion has been unprecedented." "The employee response has been unprofessional and inappropriate," I replied. "These people are questioning a decision made by the board based on merit and performance." "Nevertheless," said board member Victoria Sterling, "we have to consider what's best for company stability. The protests are affecting productivity. Clients are starting to ask questions." That's when I realized what was happening. They were preparing to throw me under the bus to save themselves from dealing with an uncomfortable situation. "Are you asking me to resign?" I asked directly. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. "We're asking you to consider what's best for the company," Preston finally said. I stood up slowly, gathering my papers. I need time to think about this. That night, I sat in my apartment looking over the company's financial reports. What I discovered made everything clear. We were in serious trouble. The company was hemorrhaging money faster than anyone realized. Our biggest clients were considering leaving. 3 major projects had gone over budget by enormous amounts. We were looking at massive layoffs within the next quarter, at least 25% of our workforce. The same people protesting my promotion were about to lose their jobs, and they had no idea. But I also found something else in those files. 6 months earlier, I had submitted a comprehensive restructuring plan to the board. A plan that would have prevented these layoffs, cut unnecessary spending, and repositioned the company for growth. The board had rejected it without serious consideration, calling it too radical and unrealistic. Garrett had been in that meeting. He'd been one of the loudest voices against my proposal. That's when I made my decision. If they wanted me gone, I'd give them exactly what they wanted, but I'd do it in a way that would teach them a lesson they'd never forget. The next morning, I called an emergency all-company meeting. Word spread quickly through the building. By 10 a.m., our main auditorium was packed with nearly 3,000 employees. The energy was electric with anticipation. I walked onto that stage to a mixture of boos and scattered applause. Signs saying, "Step down and resign now," were visible throughout the crowd. I could see Garrett in the front row, smiling confidently. I stepped up to the microphone and waited for quiet. "You want me gone," I said simply. The auditorium fell silent. "I've heard your message loud and clear, so I'm going to give you exactly what you're asking for." The cheering started immediately. People jumped to their feet, applauding and whistling. Garrett's smile widened. I waited for them to quiet down before continuing. Effective immediately, I'm stepping away from all day-to-day operations for 90 days. During that time, this company will be restructured from the ground up. You'll be divided into 15 cross-functional teams, each with representatives from every department. The cheering stopped. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Each team will have 90 days to develop a comprehensive strategy to improve company performance, increase efficiency, and enhance profitability. The winning strategy will be implemented company-wide. The team that develops it will be promoted to senior leadership positions. Now the auditorium was completely silent. What I'm not going to tell you is the full scope of the challenges this company is currently facing. That information stays with me. Your job is to solve problems you don't know exist yet. I looked directly at Garrett. "You wanted to lead this company? Here's your chance. All of you." I walked off that stage to total silence, leaving behind a room full of people who had no idea what they'd just gotten themselves into. For the next 3 months, I watched from the sidelines as chaos consumed the company. Teams formed and disbanded. Arguments broke out in meetings. People who had never worked together were suddenly forced to collaborate on projects they didn't understand. Garrett naturally positioned himself as the leader of Team Alpha, bringing together the 47 people who had signed the email questioning my leadership. They were confident, vocal, and completely convinced they would develop the winning strategy. I received daily reports from Cameron, who remained as my assistant even during my absence. The teams were struggling. Most had no real understanding of the company's actual financial situation. They were developing strategies based on incomplete information, treating this like an academic exercise rather than a fight for survival. Meanwhile, I used my 3 months away to quietly reach out to our major clients, reassuring them that the company remained stable despite the internal upheaval. I worked behind the scenes to prevent any major contracts from being canceled. I was essentially doing damage control for a company that had temporarily expelled me. As the 90-day deadline approached, it became clear that most teams were going to fail spectacularly. Their strategies were either completely unrealistic or would actually make the company's problems worse. But Team Alpha was different. Led by Garrett, they had developed something genuinely impressive. Their proposal was comprehensive, innovative, and would actually solve many of the company's core problems. It included restructuring recommendations that would preserve jobs while cutting costs, new revenue streams that could be implemented quickly, and efficiency improvements that would save millions of dollars annually. It was brilliant. It was exactly what the company needed. It was also exactly the same strategy I had proposed to the board 6 months earlier. Presentation day arrived on a Friday in November. The entire company gathered in the auditorium to hear each team present their strategies. I sat in the back row, notebook in hand, saying nothing. 14 teams presented before Team Alpha. Some proposals were decent but limited. Most were disasters that would have bankrupted the company within a year. Then Garrett took the stage. He was confident, charismatic, and completely convincing as he laid out their strategy. The audience was captivated. Board members were taking notes and nodding approvingly. By the time he finished, it was clear that Team Alpha had won. The applause was thunderous. People were on their feet, cheering for Garrett and his team. Preston Blackwood stood up and announced that Team Alpha's strategy would be implemented immediately, and that Garrett would be promoted to Chief Strategy Officer. That's when I stood up. The applause died as I walked slowly down the aisle toward the stage. Every eye in the room was on me. I could hear my heels clicking on the floor, the only sound in the completely silent auditorium. I climbed the steps to the stage and walked to the microphone. Garrett stepped aside, looking confused and slightly annoyed that I was interrupting his moment of triumph. "Congratulations," I said, looking directly at him. "That was a truly exceptional presentation. Your strategy will save approximately 3,000 jobs that would have been eliminated next quarter. It will also return this company to profitability within 6 months." Garrett smiled, clearly pleased with the praise. "Thank you, Elena. I'm glad you recognize good work when you see it." I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. "I'm curious about something, though. How did you know this strategy would work so well?" "We spent 3 months developing it," he replied. "We analyzed every aspect of the company's operations." "Interesting." I opened the folder and pulled out a presentation deck. Because this is the exact same strategy I presented to the board of directors on May 15th of this year. I connected my laptop to the projection system and displayed my original presentation on the screen behind us. The date stamp was clearly visible. So was the board's rejection letter, which I displayed on the next slide. The temperature in that room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "Every recommendation you just made, I made 6 months ago. The restructuring plan? Mine. The new revenue streams? Mine. The efficiency improvements? Mine. Even the implementation timeline is identical." Garrett's face had gone completely white. That's impossible. We developed this independently." I clicked to the next slide, which showed email timestamps and meeting records. "Actually, you had access to my original presentation through the board archives. Which means you either plagiarized my work deliberately, or you accidentally recreated something that already existed because you never bothered to do your research." The auditorium was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming. "But here's what really fascinates me," I continued, clicking to the final slide. "When I presented this strategy 6 months ago, you were sitting in that board meeting, Garrett. You personally called my plan unrealistic and too aggressive. You said I didn't understand business realities." I looked out at the audience, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "So either you were wrong then, or you're wrong now. Either way, the person who actually developed this strategy, the strategy you're all celebrating, has been standing right here the entire time." I clicked off the presentation and faced the crowd. "You wanted me removed because you thought I was unqualified. But the solution you're now embracing as brilliant is exactly what I tried to give you months ago. The difference is that now it's coming from someone you're more comfortable following." I turned back to Garrett. "You'll implement this strategy with my full support. You'll get complete credit for its success. And every time someone congratulates you for saving this company, you'll know exactly whose idea it really was." The silence was absolute. 3,000 people staring at me, finally understanding what had really happened. I walked toward the exit, then stopped and turned back one more time. "Oh, and one more thing. The board meeting to discuss my permanent return to the Chief Strategy Officer position is scheduled for Monday morning. I hope to see you all then." I left that auditorium to complete silence, but I could feel the weight of 3,000 stares following me out. What happened next would change everything, not just for me, but for every single person who had demanded my removal. Because the story I just told you isn't even the real revenge. That was just the setup. Monday morning came faster than anyone expected. I arrived at the office at 6 a.m., 2 hours before the board meeting. The building felt different somehow, quieter, more tense. Word of Friday's revelation had spread over the weekend, and I could feel the shift in energy the moment I stepped through the front doors. Cameron was waiting for me with coffee and a stack of messages. "The phones haven't stopped ringing since Friday afternoon," he said. "Reporters, industry publications, headhunters. Everyone wants to know what's happening here." I nodded, settling into my temporary office. "Any word from the board?" Preston called 3 times over the weekend. Victoria Sterling sent an email asking for a private meeting before the board session, and he hesitated. Garrett submitted his resignation letter yesterday evening. That surprised me. I'd expected him to fight, to try to spin the situation somehow. Interesting. What reason did he give? "Personal circumstances requiring immediate attention." Cameron handed me the letter. Very brief. I read through Garrett's resignation. 3 sentences. No explanation. Effective immediately. He was running rather than facing the consequences of what everyone now knew he'd done. But Garrett leaving wasn't the real story. What people didn't understand yet was that everything, the protests, the 90-day challenge, even Garrett's plagiarism, had been leading to this moment. And I was about to show them exactly how deep this went. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. At 8:30, I walked into the conference room to find all 14 board members already seated. The atmosphere was completely different from our last meeting. These people who had been ready to sacrifice me 3 months ago were now looking at me with something approaching respect. Preston stood as I entered. "Elena, we owe you an apology. What happened on Friday was illuminating." "Illuminating is one way to put it," I replied, taking my seat at the far end of the table, though I prefer the word predictable. Victoria Sterling leaned forward. "We want to formally reinstate you as Chief Strategy Officer, effective immediately, with a 20% salary increase and expanded authority over company operations." I opened my briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Before we discuss my reinstatement, there are some things you need to know about what really happened during my 90-day absence." I placed the first document on the table. This is a signed letter of intent from Meridian Global Consulting. I caught myself. That was one of the forbidden names. From one of our biggest competitors. They approached me during week 2 of my absence with an offer to become their chief executive officer. The room went dead silent. "The salary was triple what you're paying me here. Full equity package. Complete autonomy to build my own team." I placed another document on the table. "This is their formal offer letter, dated 6 weeks ago." Preston's face had gone pale. "Elena, if you're considering leaving—" "I'm not considering it," I interrupted. "I already accepted it." You could have heard a pin drop in that room. My start date with them is January 15th, which gives this company exactly 8 weeks to implement the strategy that will save it from bankruptcy. Victoria was staring at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. "But you developed that strategy. You can't just leave and let us implement it without you." I smiled for the first time in months. "Actually, I can, because the strategy belongs to Team Alpha now, remember? Garrett and his 47 colleagues are the official creators of the plan that's going to save this company. They get full credit, full responsibility, and full accountability for making it work." I placed a third document on the table. This is the detailed implementation timeline for the restructuring plan. It requires constant oversight, daily decision-making, and deep understanding of every component. The kind of oversight that only comes from having developed the strategy yourself. Preston was beginning to understand, but Garrett resigned. Yes, he did, which leaves his 46 remaining team members to implement a plan they didn't actually create, for a company they've spent 3 months criticizing, while solving problems they still don't fully understand. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the main floor. Below, I could see employees arriving for work, most of them probably still processing what had happened on Friday. "Here's what you don't know," I continued, turning back to face the board. "During my 90-day absence, I wasn't just sitting at home. I was working 18-hour days, conducting the most comprehensive analysis of this company's operations that's ever been done." I placed a thick binder on the table. This contains detailed profiles of every employee who signed the petition demanding my removal. Their performance ratings, their productivity metrics, their actual contributions to company revenue over the past 3 years. Victoria opened the binder and started reading. Her expression changed immediately. "What you'll find," I said, "is that the people who protested my promotion represent some of the lowest performing segments of our workforce. They're the ones who've been coasting on the work of others, who've been resistant to change, who've been actively undermining company efficiency for years." I walked back to my seat. The restructuring plan they've now endorsed will eliminate approximately 40% of redundant positions held primarily by people who signed that petition. The realization hit the room like a physical force. "You mean," Preston started. "I mean they've unknowingly designed their own termination plan. The strategy they're celebrating will result in most of them losing their jobs. Not because I want revenge, but because the company genuinely can't afford to keep paying people who don't contribute to its success." I pulled out another document. This is the list of employees who will be retained under the new structure. Surprisingly, it consists mainly of people who didn't protest my promotion. People who were actually focused on doing their jobs instead of playing office politics. Victoria was still reading through the performance profiles. "Some of these numbers are shocking. How did we not know about this before?" Because nobody wanted to do the difficult work of actually measuring individual performance. It was easier to maintain the status quo than to make hard decisions about who was really contributing value. I sat back down. But there's more. The 90-day challenge wasn't just about developing a strategy. It was also about identifying natural leaders, creative thinkers, and people who could adapt to changing circumstances. I placed one final document on the table. "This is my recommendation for the new organizational structure. The people who will be promoted to replace those who will be let go." Preston picked up the list and his eyes widened. "These are mostly junior and mid-level employees." "Exactly. People who've been doing excellent work without recognition. People who participated in the challenge because they wanted to contribute, not because they wanted to prove a point about me." I looked around the table at 14 faces that were finally beginning to understand the full scope of what had happened. "So here's your choice," I said. "You can implement the strategy that Team Alpha developed, that Team Alpha plagiarized from me, and deal with the consequences of restructuring a company without the person who actually understands how the plan works. Or," I let the word hang in the air, "or you can make me an offer that's compelling enough to change my mind about leaving." The negotiation took 4 hours. When we finally reached an agreement, I had been promoted to Chief Executive Officer with a salary that was double my previous pay, complete authority over all company operations, and an equity package that would make me wealthy beyond anything I'd previously imagined. But the money wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the power to finally run this company the way it should be run. The announcement went out that afternoon. Elena Rodriguez was now the Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. The restructuring plan would be implemented over the next 8 weeks, with all personnel decisions to be made by the new CEO. The response was immediate and predictable. The same people who had protested my promotion to Chief Strategy Officer were now panicking about my elevation to the top position in the company. But this time, they had no grounds for complaint. After all, they had endorsed the strategy that made this possible. Over the next month, I methodically implemented the plan that would transform the company. 43% of the workforce was eliminated, exactly as the analysis had predicted. Of the 2,000 people who had signed the petition demanding my removal, fewer than 300 kept their jobs. But here's what made it truly devastating. Every single termination was based on objective performance metrics and strategic necessity. There was no favoritism, no personal vendetta, no unfair treatment. Just business decisions based on the restructuring plan that the protesters themselves had celebrated. Juniper from accounting, who had carried that dictator Alina sign, was let go because her position was redundant under the new efficiency model. Trevor from marketing, who had been so vocal about my lack of qualifications, was terminated because his department was being consolidated. Daniela from HR, who had processed the petition against me, lost her job because the new structure required fewer administrative positions. Each of them received their termination notice with a letter explaining that their position was being eliminated as part of the comprehensive restructuring strategy developed by Team Alpha. The strategy they had supported, the strategy they had demanded be implemented. The irony was perfect, and it was completely legal. Meanwhile, the people who had supported me, or who had simply focused on their work instead of office politics, were thriving under the new structure. Many received promotions and salary increases. The company's productivity increased by 30% within 6 weeks. But the real masterstroke came when the business press started covering our transformation. Article after article praised the innovative restructuring strategy that had saved the company from bankruptcy. They interviewed the remaining members of Team Alpha, who had to stand there and take credit for a plan they hadn't actually developed, while watching their former colleagues lose their jobs because of that same plan. The financial results spoke for themselves. Within 2 months, we had returned to profitability. Within 4 months, our stock price had increased by 70%. Industry analysts were calling it one of the most successful corporate turnarounds in recent history. And through it all, I never once mentioned the protests, the petitions, or the people who had questioned my qualifications. I didn't need to. The results spoke louder than any words ever could. 6 months after becoming CEO, I was invited to speak at the National Business Leadership Conference. The topic was turning crisis into opportunity. As I stood on that stage, looking out at an audience of executives from around the country, I thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. The protests that had tried to destroy me had actually given me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities. The people who had questioned my leadership had unknowingly provided me with the mandate to restructure the company exactly as I had always wanted to. The strategy they had stolen from me had become the foundation for my greatest professional triumph. I had turned my enemies into the architects of their own downfall, and they had done it willingly, enthusiastically, while thinking they were defeating me. The greatest revenge isn't destroying your opponents. It's watching them destroy themselves while believing they're winning. As I finished my speech that day, receiving a standing ovation from 3,000 business leaders, I realized that sometimes the universe has a sense of humor. Sometimes it gives you exactly what you need, disguised as everything you didn't want. 2,000 people had protested my promotion, demanding that I be removed from a position of authority. In the end, their protest had elevated me to the highest position in the company, with more power and influence than I had ever dreamed possible. They had gotten exactly what they asked for, and so had I. Looking back now, I can honestly say that those protesters did me the biggest favor of my career. They forced me to prove myself in a way that simply getting promoted never could have. They gave me the opportunity to demonstrate not just my competence, but my strategic thinking, my leadership abilities, and my capacity to turn adversity into advantage. Most importantly, they taught me that sometimes the best response to people who underestimate you isn't to argue with them or try to convince them they're wrong. Sometimes the best response is to let them dig their own graves while you quietly position yourself to benefit from their mistakes. If you've made it this far in my story, I want you to know that this isn't just about corporate politics or workplace drama. This is about what happens when people let prejudice and assumption override evidence and merit. This is about the price of trying to tear down someone who's worked for everything they've achieved. But it's also about resilience, strategy, and the power of staying focused on your goals even when everything seems to be working against you. So if you're facing your own crowd of protesters, your own group of people who think you don't belong where you are, remember this. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being so successful that their criticism becomes irrelevant. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like you had to prove yourself to people who had already made up their minds about you, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their current struggles might just be setting them up for their greatest victory. And leave me a comment telling me about a time when someone underestimated you. I read every single comment, and I love hearing your stories of turning adversity into triumph. Because at the end of the day, the people who try to hold you back are often just showing you exactly how high you're capable of rising.